If not God, then what? If not God, then how do we make sense of life? If not God, then how do we make sense of morality? If atheism is true, then do moral values exist? Well, if we desire a good life, then we ought to do things which promote good relationships with others. And if you don't believe me, then take a look at the golden rule, which is found in every successful religion. And this is due to the fact that it promotes a healthy, happy, and prosperous society. Tenet number 1, you should treat others as you would like to be treated. Tenet 2, you should not treat others in ways that you would not like to be treated. This is often touted as the foundation of Christian morality, but it's also the foundation of every other religious moral system, and it has absolutely nothing to do with God or an afterlife or God's nature, and it has everything to do with human interactions within society, within family. Guess what? If you want to be successful at those things, you shouldn't be a selfish asshole. That's not exactly mind-boggling. It's not hard to understand. It's not a mystery. We intuitively value ourselves and by extension those within our social group. And so it makes sense to promote success in society because that translates into success for our friends and family, our loved ones, and ourselves. When we fulfill others, we are fulfilled. This maxim explicitly states that to have the best possible relationship with society, we ought to treat others as we would like to be treated. This is goal-oriented. If you value success, you ought to do things which make you successful. I'm defining morality as a set of principles or notions about which behaviors are correct or incorrect in relation to our goals, our desires, and our social relationships. Nothing can force you to value X the same way society does, but if you want to participate in social progress, you ought to act in accordance with normative behavior. One obvious lesson that we can take from the golden rule is that desire ultimately motivates normative behavior. If we desire to be happy and prosperous, we ought to promote those features within society so that we can have them for ourselves, our friends, and our family, and our community. That is the good. Wanting that for the global community is the greater good. So, can moral obligations exist without a God? Again, this requires goal-oriented motivation. If you promise your children that you'll love and protect them, a promise motivated by parental instincts, then you ought to keep that promise. The normative ought comes from the goal to be a good parent, which is a natural inclination. And so you might ask, where does the conscience come from? Part of that answer is found in moral philosophy, the golden rule. And part of that answer comes from our psychology, which has its foundations in evolution. We decide what we value and why. That's why moral questions take some deliberation and debate. It takes philosophy. There are 3 major ethical theories or moral philosophies, and none of them actually require the existence of a God to make sense. There's virtue ethics, consequentialism, and deontology. In virtue ethics, a virtue is a characteristic which makes its possessor good, such as courage, justice, honesty, dignity, restraint, mercy, humor, wisdom, humanity. To a virtue ethicist, virtues are the good, and vices are bad. An action is good if it is what a virtuous agent would do in the circumstances. They promote the best possible version of ourselves. Under virtue ethics, the Bible is certainly morally reprehensible. And it may well be the case that Yahweh commanded disobedient children to be killed by their parents, but that does not mean it ought to be the case. Doing so is not what a virtuous agent would do in those circumstances. It does not promote the virtues, either in the victim or the perpetrator. Consequentialism is concerned with how outcomes affect well-being. It is the view that normative facts depend on consequences. To a consequentialist, the good is the behavior or characteristic which brings about the best result for promoting health, happiness, prosperity, If you value happiness and well-being in society, then you ought to behave in a way which promote it. Valuing happiness and well-being in yourself and others is good because it promotes behaviors which lead to those ends. This is a popular conception of morality because it seems that all of our quote-unquote ethical choices are concerned with the result that they will have for ourselves and those we care about and society. Deontological ethics is basically concerned with obeying principles or duties which must not be disobeyed. To a deontologist, killing is prohibited even in self-defense. Lying is prohibited even to save someone's life. Under deontology, obeying certain principles is the good, while disobeying them is the bad. It's the act in and of itself that is either good or bad, regardless of the consequences or what a virtuous agent would do in those circumstances. This view is most commonly contrasted with consequentialism, and the major types of deontology are divine command theory. There's also natural rights theory, which is the view that there really are human rights, and contractarian ethics, which holds that moral norms derive from social contracts and mutual agreement. If we all agree as a society that we should treat each other by the golden rule, then that's the basis for our social contract and normative facts. An atheist can be a deontologist, at least under natural rights theory or contractarian ethics, since they don't require a belief or the existence of gods. Under a religious view of morality, morality has to come from some Platonic form or some divine nature. But God values obedient souls, even if human lives are dispensable and human suffering is preferred over disobedience. So having a religious grounding of morality means that you're not really concerned with human lives or human suffering. All you're concerned with is the people follow your religion blindly. Under divine command theory, God's nature is defined as the good. And so to be good means to obey God and to try to be godlike. So if God orders a parent to murder her child, it's a moral obligation. The problem here, again, not only is that this violates the human conscience and all of our intuitions and our sensibilities about what we ought to do to have a good life. The other problem is that God is hidden and incomprehensible, and even theists disagree with some of the commands within their religious texts. It seems to violate our human intuitions about morality. And so, generally speaking, even theists within their own religion regard some of the things within the Bible or the Quran or the Torah to be utterly reprehensible and disgusting, even from the mouth of God himself. A secular view of morality comes more from human nature or from the human conscience. Human beings value prosperity for their loved ones and for themselves, and by extension their community. Social and personal wellness is desired. Now, while God's existence is an open question that can never be answered, desires actually exist. Human compassion and empathy exists. Under this view, human prosperity is the good, and to be good means to promote well-being, living by the golden rule, recognizing that you do not want to suffer unnecessarily, and so you do not want to cause unnecessary suffering to others. It means to be compassionate, empathetic, and to expect that same treatment from others. Under a theistic view, morality is grounded in God's nature, which leads to principles like the golden rule, which informs human morality somehow. Presumably, God will also give humans a conscience. But if that's the case, then we don't actually need God or religion to ground our moralities. We can just ground it in our conscience. And if God gives people a conscience, then it's strange that he gives it to different people in different degrees. It's strange that we have sociopaths who don't have a conscience, and this is better explained under naturalism than it is under a supernatural hypothesis. Under a secular view of morality, morality is grounded in human conscience, which leads to principles like the golden rule, which informs human morality. Under a secular view, the human conscience comes from nature, which can be explained by psychology. Under the theistic view, God's nature is how it is for absolutely no reason. So any value opinions that God might have are based in nothing, are completely arbitrary. God didn't intelligently design his own nature, and so any opinions or preferences or values that God has based on his nature are completely arbitrary and are founded on absolutely no reason whatsoever. So Christian morality, at best, is simply arbitrary. And perhaps that's why even Christians don't follow their own commandments from the Old Testament and often disagree with some of the moral positions of the New Testament. Of course, you could say that secular morality is perhaps arbitrary in some sense as well. Why does the human conscience have the general values that it does? Well, it's because we're a social species, and evolutionary psychology is a product of these ancient relationships between social groups. It actually has a reason behind it. The things that we consider to be moral tend to be the things which promote a harmonious social dynamic, or at the very least, a social dynamic that is fit for survival. That might not be a good enough reason for you, but it's not arbitrary. And it actually has an explanation that makes some real-world sense. If you still want to say that both systems are equally arbitrary, that's fine. It's not the case, but that's fine to hold that opinion. All I'm interested in doing is showing that it is possible to have a sensible, coherent moral framework while being an atheist. And I'm not saying that theists aren't moral. I'm saying that if they are moral, they borrow from secular moral philosophy, from secular ethics. They listen to their own conscience rather than their own Bible. They love their families, their friends, their communities, their fellow human being more than they love the commandments of their God. And this is a good thing. It's a credit to modern Christians. Ask a Christian today, if you heard a booming voice in your head that said, "I am God," and that voice said, "Pick up a knife and kill your son or your daughter or your mother or your father or your wife or your husband," I think most Christians in this country would refuse to do it. And in fact, they'd go to the hospital. They'd go to a psychologist. They'd get themselves checked out. Because a sane person doesn't behave like Abraham behaved. The best piece of moral philosophy that comes from religion is the Golden Rule, and it has nothing to do with gods. It has nothing to do with some ultimate standard morality. It has nothing to do with absolutes. It has nothing to do with being completely objective. What it is saying is that if you want to be happy and prosperous, then you ought to promote those things within your community. Because morality only makes sense in terms of interpersonal relationships between people.